Greetings. I'm Bob Grossman, retired faculty from the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences. And welcome to the monthly Retired Distinguished Professor Seminar Series, our second year. Our first year included topics on space science, education, astrogeophysics, molecular biology, engineering, history, music, and dance, showcasing the wide range of intellectual endeavor the Boulder campus of this great research university can produce. Tonight, we present the classics. The classics bring ancient wisdom to the present. Distinguished Professor Carole Newlands will present Before Burns, Scots Poetry and the Classics. Her talk will be recorded. She has also produced some additional material that you can see at this recorded site. The URL will be in the chat room. Questions should be directed into the chat room, and her interlocutor, Elizabeth Bowen, a former student, now teaching at Latin at Denver's Evelyn High School. She's a writer and a critic of Latin poetry, and who is helping Professor Newlands edit a book. Take it away, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Robert. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's seminar. My name is Elizabeth Bowman. I am a recent graduate of the MA program in Classics at CU Boulder, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Carole Newlands. Dr. Newlands has been teaching at CU Boulder for 11 years. Her research on Latin poetry spans the Augustan and post-Augustan eras to the late antique and medieval. Her interest in the reception of classical poetry and in her own Scottish heritage have inspired her current book in progress titled The Voice of the North, Scotland and the Classics. In this book, Dr. Newlands explores the influence of Roman poets on the Scots writers Gavin Douglas, Allan Ramsay, James Macpherson, and Sir Walter Scott. This book, which I have had the incredible opportunity to read and to edit, is a fascinating dive into the efforts and aspirations of Scots poets, authors, and artists, both to ground Scottish literature and history in a classical context, and to craft a unique, independent Scottish literary and cultural identity worthy of celebration and preservation. In tonight's seminar, Dr. Newlands will briefly discuss Gavin Douglas's 1513 translation into Scots of Virgil's epic, the Aeneid, and then focus on Allan Ramsay's 18th century translation of one of the most beloved odes of the Augustan poet Horace. Thank you again for joining us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Newlands.
Everybody, thank you very much for being here on this cold wintry night. Bob and Elizabeth, thank you so much for your generous introductions. It's a real privilege for me to be here this evening and able to share some of my current research on this book, The Voice of the North, Scotland and the Classics. I will be focusing on early Scottish literature and history. I also, given that it's such a cold wintry night, plan to make it somewhat convivial. So let me begin. Okay, so everyone knows a bit of Scottish poetry. For instance, when we sing Auld Lang Syne at New Year, that's Robert Burns. And in a few days' time, on January 25th, fans of Robert Burns across the world will be celebrating his birthday with an annual feast and recitals of his poetry. The highlight of this feast is a ceremonial entry of the haggis, accompanied by bagpipes and a toast to the bard. And here's our humble haggis. Okay. The master of ceremonies addresses the haggis in Burns's classic words as fair chieftain of the pudding race, before slicing through the haggis with a scian dhu or Highland dagger This is an image of a Burns Night festival feast happening in Sweden. I'm a little alarmed that he might actually be using a sword rather than a dagger. However, the rich tradition of Scottish literature outside Burns is scarcely known today, even in Britain. The focus of my talk will be two of the major poets who influenced Robert Burns, Gavin Douglas in the early 16th century and Allan Ramsay in the early 18th century. They are examples of eminent Scottish poets who, using their vernacular tongue, powerfully articulated the tensions and struggles of a small country seeking to preserve and protect a distinctive culture that was frequently threatened by its more powerful neighbour to the south, Scotland. Moreover, a knowledge of the classics was also crucial to how Scots shaped their separate identity. Until very recently, the study of Latin and Greek in schools was foundational to the Scottish educational curriculum. Indeed, since Scotland was a country where multiple languages were spoken, and to some degree still is, Gaelic, Lowland Scots, English and French, Latin provided a unifying language and literature, a common storehouse of knowledge. Especially since, unlike in England, education was free or of minor expense. The many Scottish poets writing in Latin in the Renaissance were widely admired in Europe. To quote the 16th century French humanist Joseph Scaliger, Scotland was the limit of Roman power. Scotland was the fulfillment of Roman eloquence. Both Gavin Douglas and Allan Ramsay translated into Scots the works of famous Latin poets, thus making the classics even more broadly accessible to the general population. Now, nowadays we read many books in translation, generally without a thought to the translator. But in the period I'm discussing today, translation of Greek and Latin texts provided enormous prestige, both to the translator and to their country. For an excellent translation showed that the language of that country could rival the eloquence of Greek and Latin. Indeed, through translation, a country acquired the cultural capital of ancient Greece and Rome. There was also a political dimension to translation that has been particularly true of Scotland, a small northern country, rugged and sea-girt, always struggling to assert its distinctive identity apart from its wealthier, more populous neighbour. And even today, of course, Scotland is always wondering whether it should seek political independence, vote for political independence from England. It has its own parliament now, but it only has limited powers. So the aim of my talk is broadly recuperative. First of all, I wish to show how nationalist agendas have warped linguistic and literary history. As John Kerrigan argued in his important book, Archipelagic English, we should be wary of using the term English literature as an umbrella term for the diverse languages and literatures of the British Isles, for it occludes their independent status and their distinct identities and worth. My current book project, The Voice of the North, on the importance of Latinity to Scottish cultural identity, explores a largely unexamined field. Secondly, therefore, I will argue, as I argue in my book and will argue here, in Scotland, the translation of classical texts has been a powerful instrument for overcoming prejudice and acknowledging the distinctiveness of Scottish language and literature that is still evident today. Sorry, my mouse is a little frisky. Scotland may not yet have acquired the political independence that the Scottish barons so eloquently declared in the 1320 Declaration of Arbroath. As long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor for riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. This has been called the Scottish Magna Carta. So for these barons, freedom was a foundational principle of life itself, but Scotland has at least preserved an artistic freedom that merits wider appreciation. So let's start with Gavin Douglas briefly. He was a poet, an aristocrat, and Bishop of Dunkeld during the reign of the Scottish King James IV, when Scotland was an independent nation. As you can see here from this plaque in St Giles Cathedral, Edinburgh, he started off as provost of this church. He was a son of the Earl of Angus, a distinguished poet and author of a celebrated metrical translation of Virgil, and alas, he died in exile in London in 1522. And here's Dunkeld today, a nice little market town, and the cathedral on the right, of which Douglas was bishop, alas, ruined as so many of Scottish cathedrals are as a result of the Reformation, but still with the parish church operational. Douglas was celebrated as one of the Makers, the name given to a quartet of brilliant, widely admired Scottish poets writing in the early 16th century. Douglas was the first poet in the British Isles to translate into the vernacular in 1513 the great national epic of Rome, Virgil's Aeneid, completed in 19 BC. The Aeneid describes how, after the fall of Troy to the Greeks, the survivors fled to Italy to establish Rome and a great empire. This so-called translatio imperii, translation of political power, is also a literary one, for Virgil emulated Homer and his Greek epic to create a new Trojan narrative in the form of the revival of Troy in Italy itself. Douglas's so-called Aeneados, his translation of the Aeneid, performs a further literary translatio imperii, translocating Virgil's epic into Scotland. In Douglas's prologue to his translation, the Aeneados, he emphasizes that he chose Scots as the language of translation. Whatso it be, this book I dedicate, written in the language of Scots nation, and thus I make my protestation. He sees the translation of the Aeneid as a chance to develop and showcase a high style for the Scottish vernacular. He thus appropriates the cultural authority of Virgil and Rome for Scotland. And at the same time, he affirms a distinct sphere of Scottish literary influence and achievement within the British Isles. Scotland might be seen as geographically small and marginal, but nevertheless, Douglas's great achievement, the translation of Rome's national epic into the language of his own sovereign nation, claims Scotland's cultural centrality within the British Isles. One of the pleasures of Douglas's translation lies in his accommodation of the ancient world to the present. Virgil's Trojans, for instance, dine on venison rather than beef, and ancient priestesses are called nuns. A special pleasure is also generated by the prologues that Douglas composed for each of the 13 books of his translation. These prologues are works of creative, independent poetry with a strong authorial presence. The mood ranges from comic to devout. I'll give one example. Douglas begins Book 7 with the description of waking up early one morning in the dead of winter. Douglas is halfway through his translation of the Aeneid, and he's really reluctant because it's so cold to leave the fire and go to the writing stand to carry on with his translation. So this passage, I think, gives us probably our earliest example or description of writer's block. I'll read it in Scots and this is just an example of the first page of the manuscript, which is now in Cambridge, which seems to be Douglas's own autograph copy. We think these are his notes in the margins. So it was common then to write notes and publish the manuscript. Okay, so this is Winter's Morning and Writer's Block, part of the prologue to the 7th book of the Aeneid. And here's the translation at the bottom. Shivering with, and you can notice how alliterative and evocative Scots is. Shivering for cauld, the season was so snell. Shoop with hate flambe to fleam the freezing fell. And as I bounty me to the fire me by, baith up and down the hoose I did espy. And seeing Virgil on a lettering stand, to write anon I hint a pen in hand, forto before him the poet grave and sad, whom so far forth ere then begun I had, and walks a night some dealing in my heart, there rested incomplete so great a part. And to myself I said, in good effect, thou maun drawn forth, the yoke lies on thy neck. So the pace of the work of Douglas's translation is geared to the passing of the seasons, with the prologue to Book 7, to Virgil's 12 books in total, placed at midwinter and at the midpoint of the Aeneid. So with self-deprecatory humour, Douglas combines writer's anxiety with vivid description of the harsh conditions of winter. His project is only half finished, and it assumes the status of a burden. Both land and mind are frozen. But he did finish the work, and as we see from his flourishing signature at the end of the Aeneid. So, by choosing Scots, not English, as the language of translation, Douglas redefines the Aeneid as a foundational text of Scottish literary history. And there was a democratic educational impulse behind his translation. In June 1496, just 17 years before Douglas finished the Aeneid, the translation of the Aeneid, the Scottish Parliament had passed legislation insisting that all children of barons and middle-class families from the age of 8 and 9 must study in school the liberal arts, including law and Latin. Douglas at the end refers to this act by saying that he has written, saying that he expresses the hope that his work will be an essential help for those wanting to teach Virgil to school children. He also says that he hopes his work will be read to the unlettered. Okay, those who can't read but would enjoy. We can see that this work could have been performed as well orally to those who did not have reading or writing. All the same, Douglas published his translation at the worst possible time, one of the worst times in Roman history, in Scottish history, just weeks before the fatal Battle of Flodden Field on September 9th, 1513. He finished in August. In this battle, the English army of Henry VIII decimated the Scots and their nobility. This is the bleak memorial spot. Lost were Douglas's patron, Sir Henry Sinclair, a large number of the Scottish nobility, and the king himself, James IV of Scotland. The English army was led by Thomas Howard, and ironically, it was his son, Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, who became known as the first translator of Virgil's Aeneid in England. In the 1540s, Surrey published translations of Book 2 and 4 of the Aeneid that were deeply indebted to Douglas's translation before losing his head to Henry VIII. But although Douglas's Aeneados was known and admired south of the Scottish border, it did not gain the widespread fame and circulation that Douglas sought. It became a footnote in literary history. But let's scroll now 2 centuries to the 1720s, when the poet and playwright Allan Ramsay was at the forefront of a movement to revive a sense of pride in Scottish literature. The Scottish literary scene was at a low ebb, for Scotland was no longer an independent nation. In 1603, there was the union of the crowns of England and Scotland, and as a result, James VI of Scotland took his court south to England, to London, and that's where the centre of literary and arts patronage became. He never came back to Scotland, so Scotland lost a significant source of patronage. And here's a portrait of James of 6 of Scotland, 1st of England. Doesn't he look swell? Really, you know, these robes, he looks very comfortable and nice and warm too, and all those fur that the English court can provide. So this was followed in 1707 by the union of the parliaments of Scotland and England. This was regarded by many Scots as a further blow to the distinctive Scottish culture. Burns wrote a poem about this, describing the people who brokered the deal as "what a parcel of rogues in the nation." Selling Scotland out for money was his view. At any rate, it was a thorny relationship. However, a major edition of Douglas's translation of the Aeneid was published shortly after the Union in 1710, and this stimulated great interest in the poetic potential of the Scottish tongue. So, the poet Allan Ramsay, and this is by portrait by the Scottish painter David Aikman, was the chief leader of the early vernacular revival of Scots. In addition to writing his own Scottish poetry in various metres and genres, he produced in the 1720s and 1730s 2 important collections of early Scottish verse, the Tea Table Miscellany and the Evergreen. When the Easy Club, a group of literary men in Edinburgh, decided that club members would adopt the pseudonyms of early Scottish poets, Allan Ramsay assumed the pseudonym Gavin Douglas. Like Douglas, Ramsay was interested in classical translation as a democratizing medium that could showcase also his abilities as a Scottish poet in the tradition of his poetic ancestors. Unlike Douglas, Ramsay came from a modest background and recognized classical learning as a path to social as well as literary advancement. Ramsay turned to the Roman poet Horace rather than Virgil for his translation of the classics. Horace was a contemporary of Virgil and was extremely popular in 18th century Britain for his poems counselling a life of moderation, preferably in the countryside. His poetry is also full of wise and memorable sayings. For instance, carpe diem, snatch the day, make the most of life. Importantly, Horace had adapted ancient Greek odes into Latin. Horace thus claimed to rival the famous lyric poets of Greece. By translating several of Horace's odes into Scots, Ramsay continued the cultural and geographical translocation of the Greek ode. He also gained a significant model for his own self-fashioning as an adherent of the virtuous life, but a convivial life spent in pursuit of poetry and friendship. So now we're going to look at the initial stanzas of Ramsay's adaptation of a particularly famous Horatian ode, 1-9. The theme of Horace's ode, presented here in English translation on the left, is winter, a subject that is obviously timely right now, and generally, as far as Scots is concerned, brings out the particular vigour of the Scottish tongue, as we saw with Douglas's prologue to Book 7 of his Aeneid. Horace's ode is a dramatic monologue set on a snowy winter day, Somewhere near Rome, Mount Soracte, mentioned in the second line, is a mountain 20 miles out of Rome. The poet is indoors looking out on a frozen world and asking his slave to pile on plenty of logs and to be generous with the wine. Look how the snow lies deeply on glittering Soracte, the woods labouring under the weight of snow, now let fall their branch loads. Bitter frost has paralysed rivers, the ice is solid. Just sounds like Colorado right now, doesn't it? Unfreeze the cold, pile plenty of logs in the fireplace. A new Thaliarchus, come, bring out the Greek jar with the 4-year-old Sabine wine, and be generous. Let the gods take care of the rest. In his version of the poem, Ramsay switches the scene to one southwest of Edinburgh. Edinburgh was then known as the Athens of the North. Mount Soracte becomes the Pentland Hills near Edinburgh. Here are the first 3 stanzas then read in Scots, really a sort of blast of vigorous alliterative Scots, and the translation is down below. Sorry. Look up to Pentland's towering taps buried beneath great wreaths of snaw, or ilka clwch, ilk scar and slap, as he as any Roman wa. Driving their baws frae Windsor tea, there's no a gowfer to be seen, nor doucer folk wising a gee the bias bulls on Tamson's green. Then fling on coals and ripe the ribs, and beak the hoose baith butt and ben. That much and stoop it has but drips, then let's get in the tappet hen. Characteristically for translation practice at this time, Ramsay expands his source text. The entire adaptation more than doubles Horace's ode in length. But like Horace, in the first 3 stanzas, Ramsay invites his reader to see and feel the cold and to enjoy the cozy feeling of being indoors by a warm fire while the winter rages outside. It's a foul day, no golfers are on the green and no people playing bowls. And here's an image of what golf was like in the 1760s. If any of you play golf, these clubs look really peculiar, incredibly long to me. But anyway, these are the McDonald brothers, very nattily dressed. Now, I don't seem to be in a great place for playing golf, rather I would. And there's the, of course, the famous Old Course, the home of golf itself. Like Horace, Ramsay calls for a good fire, but notice of coal in the 3rd stanza, not wood, and plenty of drink. We should keep in mind that in the 18th century, the Scots vernacular often had a reputation for crudity and bawdiness. Ramsay wanted his poetry to be read by a broad audience of both men and women. As we have heard, one of his collections was called the Tea Table Miscellany. It's therefore significant, I believe, that Ramsay omits Horace's servant Thaliarchus, mentioned in Horace's 2nd stanza. The name Thaliarchus is Greek and denotes someone who gets parties going, sort of the lord of the feast. But he's presumably a slave. Moreover, his Greek name and his youth might suggest an erotic relationship with Horace, in the tradition of Jupiter's wine pourer, Ganymede. Ramsay rides right over any sexual and social complications of a Thaliarchus with a simple directive: let's get in the tappet hen. That let's suggests a conviviality, a community of equals ready for a good night of drinking and song together. There are no slaves here. And there is nothing in these lines to offend the educated women for whom Horace was a model of respectability. Now, Ramsay also gives the drinking scene a political edge, not in Horace, through comparative measures in the poem. So, in the first stanza, the Pentland Hills are buttressed by snow as high as any Roman wall. So this image is a reminder of the Romans' problematic attempts to establish a significant presence in Scotland with the Antonine Wall that stretched across Scotland in the mid-2nd century AD. So roughly between where Edinburgh is now and Glasgow is now, okay? Begun in 142 AD, it was abandoned some 20 years later. It just wasn't worth it. Hadrian's Wall in northern England, begun in 122 AD, proved much more durable as the northernmost frontier for the Roman Empire. So Ramsay starts his adaptation of a Horatian ode with a physical signpost, marking his country's entry into Roman culture, and also in cheeky rivalry. Scotland's hills are a monumental match for that Roman wall. In the second stanza of Horace's ode, the poet asks Thaliarchus to pour out good local Sabine vintage from a Greek jar. Scholars often take this as a metaphor for Horace's concept of translation as a union between Greek lyric form and Roman context and content. In Ramsay's translation, the drinking vessels become a metaphor for his relationship with English culture. In his third stanza, he claims that the Muchen stoop, now that's an English pint, or imperial pint of 20 British ounces, okay, holds but a dribble. That Muchen stoop, it has but dribs. On the other hand, the tappet hen, a particular Scottish vessel with a sort of chicken head, it means that a tufted hen, holds three. It holds a good big Scottish pint, which is equivalent to 3 imperial pints or 60 fluid ounces. Now, English weights and measures had been introduced to Scotland with the Union of Parliaments in 1707, but had been deeply unpopular. So there was a lot of resistance to their adoption. So there's a playful dig in Ramsay's translation at the inferiority of the English measure compared with the vigour and virility of the tappet hen and the Scottish measure. The cultural weight of Ramsay's Horatian ode, like the relative weight of the Scottish tappet hen when filled with claret or whisky, falls upon its new Scottish identity. So Horace's Romanizing of the original Greek ode thus endowed Ramsay in turn with the cultural authority to make the same ode Scottish. Moreover, by localizing Horace's ode in a Scottish wintry environment, Ramsay wittily establishes a distance from English ways as well as from Rome. Drink in the form of water or wine often functions as a metaphor for poetry. Ramsay's tappet hen distills the essence of the classics, translated into Scots. Its democratic and inclusive impulses, its distinctive localism, its linguistic range and richness, and its political edge. Just as Gavin Douglas had offered Scottish hospitality to Virgil, so Ramsay's classical translations give Horace a northern home. In conclusion, let me turn briefly to Robert Burns. As I pointed out at the start of this talk, Burns was deeply influenced by Ramsay. Like Ramsay, Burns was a poet and a collector of older Scottish songs. While he was not a translator of classical texts, he did play with classical forms and moralizing themes. In particular, in one of his best-loved poems that is often recited on Burns Night, Tam O'Shanter. This is a mock-epic narrative poem about a ne'er-do-weel Tam who stays too late in the pub on a dark and stormy night and has a terrifying encounter with witches on the way home. Now, I should say that this poem has fallen out of favour in certain academic circles, as it's regarded as being very offensive as regards its gender politics, as regards how it treats women. But I would say that Burns is actually being funny with men, with women, and just having fun with the whole story. He's just out for a bit of fun. He's out for a bit of fun with epic. He's out for a bit of fun with the moralizing tradition, and it's a great mock epic to read for Burns Night. So I think there's just a little time I could read a few lines from Burns. And you can see, actually, here's Delacroix showing the dramatic climax of Tam O'Shanter when he's pursued by witches and poor Maggie gets her tail pulled off. But to our tale. I think now that you've heard some Scots, you're probably okay without a translation. If I just read, I think maybe the most important words to know are that foo means pretty drunk, and so does druthy. Druthy means kind of thirsty. Okay. This is the start of Tam O'Shanter. When Chapman billies leave the street and druthy neighbours meet, as market days are wearing late and folk begin to tack the gate, while we sit boozing at the nappy and getting foo and unco happy, we think not o' the lang Scots miles, the mosses, waters, slaps and stiles that lie between us and our hame, where sits our sulky, sullen dame, gathering her brows like gathering storm, nursing her wrath to keep it warm. This truth found honest Tam O'Shanter, as he frae air in night did canter, all there whan near a town surpasses, for honest men and bonny lasses. But to our tale. Market night, Tam had got planted unco right, fast by an ingle blazing finely, wi' reaming swats that dranks divinely. And at his elbow, Suitor Johnny, his ancient, trusty, druthy crony. Tam loved him like a very brother. They had been foo for weeks together. The nicht drave on wi' sangs and clatter, and aye the ale was growing better. The storm without might rear and rustle, Tam didna mind the storm a whistle. So here's an anonymous print of Tam O'Shanter for the scene where he's sitting in the pub before he sets off on his terrible night ride. And if you look very carefully at the table, I think you'll see that there is a tappet hen on the table here, right? It's got the distinctive little rings around it, right? So, to me, it's a drinking vessel here that cheerfully and proudly symbolises the successful translation of the drink of the Muses to Scottish soil. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Newlands. I think I'm perhaps supposed to show up on half the screen here. I'm not sure. At any rate, I'm going to jump back in. For our audience, I am still keeping track of chat. So if anybody would like to throw some more questions in there, please don't be shy. I will keep an eye on that. But in the meantime, I do have a few questions for Dr. Newlands if you are up for taking a handful. And I'll just start with kind of more of a contextual question. At the very beginning of your talk, you mentioned that both Latin and Greek were taught in Scottish schools. And perhaps I've been unduly influenced by your book, but it seems to me that the Latin and Latin literature and Latin Roman culture perhaps sort of predominates in the Scottish literature that then is produced inspired by that. And I'm wondering if you could either correct that misconception as far as Latin versus Greek, or talk a bit about perhaps why, Virgil, for example, comes to be so influential in a way that perhaps Homer doesn't. I'm not quite sure about that.
I think there's a couple of things I can say to that. And first of all, yes, Greek was taught, but then Scotland always traditionally, because of its political situation with a very difficult neighbour, England, was always looking to Europe. And so for its allies and intellectual connections. So it was much more common for a Scottish student after studying at one of the Scottish universities like St Andrews to then go to the continent, to Leiden often, or to Paris to study. And there, you know, the common language of culture was Latin. This was how people communicated across Europe. And so Scotland had great distinction in the Renaissance for its Latin poets. We call them Neo-Latin poets. Were highly distinguished. Of course, that's an art now that has fallen by the wayside. Virgil was incredibly important for European nations because Virgil's powerful story of nation building, Troy, the great civilization which had fallen, recreated, revived on Roman soil and creating a great empire. So when Rome fell, all the European nations wanted to claim a Trojan ancestor so they could imagine they too would have a great empire. So, you know, some people say that the word Britain comes from a Trojan ancestor who was named Brutus. Not the one who's assassinated Julius Caesar, but someone else. So it was a very important text for nation building. And if I can keep answering this, it actually became not only important in the 16th century for Scotland, but also in the 18th century when the Hanoverian kings occupied the throne, the Georges in England. And so the Stuart line of Scottish kings had been deposed, forced into exile. And so the Jacobites, for them, the Latin tradition was enormously important. And Virgil's Aeneid, the story of the prince who is sent into exile but returns, became very important as a model for Jacobite aspirations that the Stuart kings would come back to the British throne. So, so Homer actually was not so well known until the Renaissance. And really it was Alexander Pope who gave Homer its first proper translation in the early 18th century, the first translation that really was admired. And then people began to get all excited in England, particularly about Homer, rather than Virgil. Meanwhile, in Scotland, people were still very, very excited by Homer. That said, it was doing a deluxe edition of Homer that sent the Jacobite Scottish press of the Fowlis brothers into bankruptcy, alas. It's probably more than you wanted to know.
That's perfect, thank you. And it actually leads pretty well into our next question from our audience, where Robert says, this is fascinating. It appears that Scottish poets were very political, as many poets are, like the troubadours. Were there any purely lyric poets? For example, Blake or Shelley?
This is something that I haven't looked into enough, and I simply must. There were Mary, Queen of Scots, encouraged because, you know, she was raised in France, essentially. She had a circle of poets that consoled her in her time in Scotland around her. And there was a lot of writing of lyric poetry there in Scots. I haven't generally influenced not so much by the classics, but by the classical tradition that we find in the Italian poets. For instance, Petrarch was enormously important as an influence on Renaissance lyric in general. So that actually is something that I want to look into. My book is really focused on people using translation adaptation of the classics, but I do need to, yes, I think that will be a treat to explore further.
You mentioned at various times, both in talking about Douglas and Ramsay, that Scots is, you said it's alliterative, it's evocative, it's vigorous, which all, it just got me thinking that, you know, when you're working with translation of any language, but of course I'm most familiar with Latin, when you're taking Latin and putting it into English, you lose so much of that poetry and so much of the artistry and the vigorous nature of it. And I mean, I started to wonder, is Scots perhaps better suited to Latin than English? Maybe that's going too far, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about putting Latin into Scots and what that does for the language aspect specifically. And I just will add on to that. I was especially interested when you mentioned, that Douglas in particular wanted his translation to be read aloud, which is of course so innate to the Latin tradition. And that's something that's been a little bit lost in our day.
Right. Can I just very quickly say something else about the lyric tradition? In some ways, I think the comic tradition is even stronger. In Scotland, there's a very strong tradition of comic poetic writing, which can be political. And as for lyric poetry, I should have mentioned one of the Makars from the early 16th century that I absolutely adore, and that is William Dunbar. I don't know if we'd call him a lyric poet, but he has some poetry that I definitely myself would call lyric, and he really exploits the full. And he can be comic, lyric, serious. He exploits the full range of the richness of the Scottish language, and he has a wonderful poem that starts, "Into these dirk and drooply days." And I think that's just a wonderful, whenever it's a day like this, that line comes into my mind. To the question of, is Scots particularly adept for translation into Latin? I think, it was a real challenge for Douglas. I think he succeeds better in some cases than in others. Ezra Pound actually loved Douglas's translation, but what he particularly liked was the storm scenes. And I've given you the winter scenes. That's when you get this particular resonance and richness of the language coming out, I think. Tragic scenes, yes. Mm-hmm. But he also actually, I will say, can write very beautifully about describe spring or summer. And then actually in those cases, there's a certain style he'll use, which was called the golden style or the aureate style, where he'll use a lot of Latinate words alternating with Scottish words, which gives a very dense texture to the Scots. I've really focused on just giving you the vernacular, but I could have given you an example of where he's mingling Latin and Scots, Latinate and Scots, sometimes in the same line, sometimes one line after the other. So that way, he's making Latin something different, He's making it Scottish, but still, acknowledging the eloquence of that language. But claiming for his sovereign nation, the sovereign language of Rome for sovereign Scotland. I'm not sure if I answered that correctly, but I really need an example to hand, but I think I've read enough.
So returning back to politics, another audience question. What about the present? Are these ancient poets, including Burns, having an impact on current Scottish politics?
Well, you know what? I really need to get back there. So I've had a ticket to Scotland, what would I say, for 4 times now that has been cancelled by British Airways. So I really need to get back there. But yes, I would say that since the 1960s, 1980s, there's been a real cultural revival in Scotland, and in the universities, attention to the classics, to the early Scots poets, and not just in poetry, but also people have been doing adaptations of Greek tragedy into Scots. But I will say there's a lively debate that continues over whether, if you want to claim status as a European nation, because many people who would like that Scotland stayed in the European Union, you probably know that Scotland overwhelmingly voted against Brexit. Okay, if you want to stay in the European Union, do you write in Scots or do you write in, basically a Scots dialect that's basically like English with some Scots inflection? So there's a vigorous debate that still goes on. Some poets are writing in the Scots of Douglas, whereas others, like Robin Robertson, I give you a link to his poetry. He'll, throw in some Scottish words, but it will be intelligible south of the border to France, read in translation. It's difficult. It's a difficult situation. So that debate has been raging since MacDermot in the 30s started writing in Scots.
That actually leads really well into my last question. And then again, I'll keep opening it up to the audience if we have more. I was thinking about that Douglas and Ramsay chose to translate into Scots versus later in your book, you talk about Macpherson, for example, with Ossian, who chose to write in English so as to make it more accessible to a broader audience. And of course, there's just a balance there, right? Because there's the want to celebrate the Scottish heritage and Scottish language versus making it more acceptable. And I didn't realize this is something that's still ongoing. So that's very interesting. But I was wondering if you could talk a bit about, have there been efforts to translate Douglas into English? What has been done to try to make this more accessible and yet still maintaining that pride in the vernacular?
There is an edition that you can buy that came out a few years ago that is a translation of the Aeneid, but I think you miss so much. What is really helpful is that there is now an online dictionary of the older Scottish tongue. So you can just sit and read, and if you can just click on a word and there it comes up. It's really great that we've got these digital resources. There also is a new edition of Douglas's translation due to come out by Priscilla Bockott, who was a wonderful scholar of Old Scots, but she died just a few months ago. I think she was just ready to publish, but unfortunately she won't actually see that edition come out, and I don't know to what extent she did with notes to help, a reader of today follow along with the Aeneid. I think it helps to read it and then, just read it aloud, and then I think it's easier than which also brings me back to thinking of, being read in the schoolroom in Douglas's time. Or maybe in court as well.
So unless we have further questions, or further things that you'd like to discuss, Dr. Newlands?
No, thank you for your letting me do a little celebration of Burns Night in advance of Burns Night, which I will probably not be celebrating with friends this year, unfortunately. So it was nice to celebrate with a group, with an interested audience. Thank you.
Just an end note. I would have to go to Scotland to have meetings perhaps once a month for a year or two. And what was interesting was the top leader, a Scottish person, would invocate the session by repeating Bobby Burns.
Oh.
To which I never was able to understand. And the second part of that is the separation of Scottish music and verse as separate from the more British Isles, so influential in American folk music and history. So those are my comments after being educated further into Scottish literature.
Thank you for bringing that up. And you've brought up, you see, a whole tradition I have not talked about, which is the Gaelic tradition. That's a totally different language that is spoken in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. It's an endangered language, and it engendered the wonderful tradition of the bagpipes, of the folk song that we have in North America, because after the Jacobite rebellions failed, many people voluntarily or were forced to leave Scotland for Canada and North America, mostly Gaels, speaking the Gaelic language. And they brought that wonderful, rich tradition of poetry and song with them.
Yes.
So you have that with you today. I didn't talk about that today. I'm talking about what has become the mainstream Scots, but we shouldn't forget the influence of Gaelic. And there's actually a wonderful Scottish Gaelic poet I would like to recommend called Sorley MacLean. He translated his own Gaelic poems into English. So you can read his Gaelic poems side by side with his English poems, and they're absolutely wonderful poems. He's from the island of Skye, and he talks about, and Ramsay, he talks about how his people were forced off the land and had to leave to go to Canada, an unknown region entirely at the time, and the sorrow of that. They're very political poems, and I recommend reading looking at that tradition too, which is so important for people in North America and Canada. So thank you for bringing that up.
No, thank you.
Douglas would have known Gaelic. He would have had people speaking Gaelic in his congregation, but I don't think Ramsay would. He was a Lowland Scots. So there was this separation of the Highland line, which is an earthquake fault, that really separated the languages.
Professor Newlands, this is Dave Cassoy speaking. On behalf of the Retired Faculty Association, I want to express my gratitude for this fascinating presentation. I would assume that many of us don't know much about Scotland or the languages that are spoken or the cultural traditions or certainly the poetry. So this is an eye-opening experience for most of us, and we appreciate it greatly. I'd also like to thank Bob Grossman and Kim Malville for setting this all up. They do a wonderful job with these distinguished professor lectures, and this tradition will continue for quite some time. And I'd also like to thank Manny in the Office of Faculty Affairs for doing the technology. Thank you very much. It all worked out great. And thank you, everybody, for attending. This was really a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much.